subconsciously we must have realized that it was going to hurt and that some people were going to get killed, but not the people we knew. They were going to manage to get through, and it was going to be very valiant and quite beautiful. Some people enlisted in the Navy because they thought it was a prettier way to die. Somebody once told me, you don't get dirty, you just go down into the water.
In 1942, the brutal reality of the Pacific War was brought home to the Allies.
You're talking to somebody, and the next time you're talking to half a head. And it happened so fast you didn't know it. You say, oh, this is what they're talking about. This is what they call war.
It was a year of epic struggle for control of Pacific sea and sky. A year in which thousands went to hell as prisoners of the Japanese.
To them, we were their tools. You cease to be human. As I was told by an officer, you belong to me. I have the power to kill you anytime I like.
Australian military nurses in Singapore before the surrender. They were evacuated on one of the last ships out, amid fears for their safety at the hands of the Japanese. But most would not make it through the ordeal that followed. Two days out from Singapore, their ship was sunk by the Japanese in vicious currents off Sumatra. "12 nurses drowned. The rest were washed up with other survivors on Bangka Island." Those who landed along the coast were taken into captivity. But on Rajik Beach, only one nurse would survive the encounter with the Japanese, 26-year-old Vivian Bullwinkle.
Something was said in Japanese by the officer, and all the men who were there, which would have been about 50 or 60 still there, were rounded up by the Japanese and taken around a bluff. When they came back, some little time later, they were all wiping their bayonets. So we looked at just each other and just sort of said, they're not taking prisoners. We were ordered into the sea, and when we were out almost up to our waists, they then machine gunned us from behind. I was hit just in the back there, and it came out here. And being very young and naive, I suppose, I always thought that once you were shot, you know, that you'd had it, that was it. And really, to my utter amazement, I found that I was still alive. And then, of course, I became frightened. And I'd taken in a lot of salt water, therefore I was being horribly seasick. And I thought, oh, they'll see my shoulders moving, you know. So then I tried to stop being seasick, and I just lay there because, well, I was too frightened to do anything else. And then gradually the waves brought me in back to the beach. And I finally plucked up enough courage to sit up and look around. And there was no sign of my colleagues. The Japanese party had gone. And there was just, you know, the usual travel brochure of blue sea, blue sky, palms and golden sand.
21 nurses, 60 wounded Allied soldiers, all murdered, their bodies washed out to sea. Vivian recovered enough to turn herself in, hiding her wounds in fear of her life if the Japanese found out she had survived the massacre. She reached prison camp feeling utterly alone.
When I had come in, I had seen a whole lot of faces about 50 yards down in a gateway, And from out of that crowd, a voice said, "It's Bullwinkle." That was the end. I said, "Somebody knows me. Somebody knows me."
We asked her what had happened. We said, "Where are the other girls?" She said, "There are no other girls." She said, "They have all been massacred."
Well, of course, they were just so horrified and just couldn't believe that something like that could happen, not only to women, but to nurses who, you know, are known to be non-combatant.
Vivian's uniform is preserved in the Australian War Memorial, its Red Cross armband clearly visible.
And I can remember standing beside her in the so-called ablutions block, and she had this hole in her uniform. And in one way, although the shock was great, to think that all those girls had been shot, at least we knew what had happened to them, which is in one way is better than not knowing.
Japan now stood unchallenged across Manchuria, Indochina, the East Indies, Malaya and Thailand, driving deep into Burma. Her navy was grabbing islands, pushing out the perimeters of power. Her way seemed open to India, even Australia.
Anyone else but me? Anyone else but me? No, 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 don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me till I come marching home.
In America, the sons of the Depression leapt at the chance to strike back, avenge Pearl Harbor, change their lives.
Anyone else but me? No, 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 don't go walking down Lover's Lane.
Rod Steiger was just 16, so he needed his alcoholic mother's written consent to enlist.
Poor Mrs. August. I said, "I want you to sign this." No, I didn't know at the time I was fighting for my life, maybe, or my freedom, or my independence. And she wouldn't, and I finally said to her, I took her arm and I put it in the back of her back. I said, "I'm going to break your arm." Now we're both crying. We're both standing there crying. And I said, I'll break your arm. I'll break your arm if you don't sign this paper. And it got to the point where she signed it. I grabbed it and I really, in a sense, almost ran from Newark to New York City.
To guard their men in battle, Japanese women sewed special belts, each with 1,000 stitches, symbolizing the protection of 1,000 women. Suzuko Numata gave her fiancé a belt and this photo, but they were formal times for sweethearts in Japan.
Even in my home we had to pretend that we were not particularly close to one another. He stayed at my house the night before he left, but he never even held my hand. So to this day I don't know how warm or how firm his hands were.
In 1942, Japan's youths were joining an unbeaten army. But overrunning Asia seemed so easy, it bred long-term danger. Some called it victory disease, the idea that Japanese needn't worry about conventional planning and support. They were invincible, naturally superior to soft Westerners. A joint American-Filipino army was cornered on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. America couldn't get supplies in or them out. On the 9th of April, 1942, sick and hungry, all 75,000 were surrendered to the Japanese. The Japanese weren't prepared for so many prisoners. The prisoners weren't prepared for so much cruelty. Their 65-mile walk to camp has gone down in history as the Bataan Death March. "60 years on, 3 veterans returned to the Philippines and retraced the old Bataan route. Phil Kuhn was an infantryman, as was Tillman Rutledge.
I mean, this is like the heat. This is like the heat we remember now.
Oliver Allen was in the Army Air Corps.
There's more like it, isn't it?
Yeah, this is more like it. This is more like the heat.
Tropical heat.
That we remember. You know, I'm from Texas, well, but it's still, this is the hottest thing I've ever been in.
It's different heat, you know?
It's different heat and it just saps you.
Yeah.
With temperatures soaring, the Japanese used water as a weapon.
A few times they encouraged us to go for the well, and then they seemed to get a heck of a joy out of either beating you. Just as you get there, they grab you and
slap you around.
Wouldn't let you, and then you just still didn't get any water. If they'd have beat us and let us have the water, we might have evened out a little bit. I think Japanese hated Americans. I really do. I think they actually hated their guts.
Another Bataan survivor is Lester Tenney, who remembers how thirst could get you killed.
One of the men ran to get some water, filled up his canteen, put water in his hand, started to drink it. Within 2 or 3 minutes, there were 3, 4, 5, 8 men waiting to get some water. The Japanese guard came over and started to laugh as the men were drinking the water, literally laughing while the men were drinking water. When the 5th man drank water and the 6th man bent down to get water, the Japanese took his bayonet and put it right down the man's neck. For no reason, just because he wanted some water.
If they escaped, the Japanese soldier would get blamed. So when a soldier saw them run off for water, he would have tried to stop them. Perhaps they were trying to escape. Incidents like that happened as a result of this kind of misunderstanding.
It was an American soldier lying near the edge of the road, and he was exhausted, just lying there, doing nothing. It was a break in the march. And this tank went right over him. Went out of his way to go over that particular individual. And then the tank behind him did the same thing. And when it had all gone, there was nothing but a human body that had been flattened into that asphalt.
The Japanese took revenge on the Filipinos for siding with America. 10-year-old Santiago Morales and his uncle lived in a village along the route and gave out food to the marchers.
When the Japanese saw my uncle trying to help an American, they stabbed him in the armpit and it came out the other side. I was in shock. I couldn't speak because I knew that if I called for help, the Japanese would kill me too. So I kept silent, and my uncle died from his wound. The Japanese then shot the American, and he died with my uncle on the same spot.
At night, the Japanese herded the marchers into buildings like this one.
Now, I don't know how many men we had in there, but I would have to guess that we may have had 1,000 men in that warehouse.
Jammed so much that no man could sit down. We were jammed in, standing up next to each other. Then they shut every window in the place and locked every door.
You lived with the stink of the urine, the stink of the defecation. You lived with the stink of the dead bodies. That's how you had to live.
The Japanese made hell for the Americans by forcing them to do terrible things to one another.
The Japanese called 4 men out of line and had them dig a ditch. When they dug the ditch, they told them to bury this man. One of the fellows said, "I can't bury him, he's still alive." So the Japanese shot this one man, called 4 more men out, said, "Now dig 2 ditches." You don't want to bury your friend. You don't want to bury a live person. But you know that if you say no, you're going to be buried.
Friends could bury you alive or save your life.
Ed White, out of F Company there, he said, "I can't continue," and I kicked him right in the butt.
Oh.
I said, "Ed, I ain't letting you give up that easy."
Oh, he was going to give up?
Yeah. He made it back.
No. Then on that march, you wonder what home of that.
But Dick Gordon had a very different experience, walking among strangers.
I learned very early in that march that it was every man for himself.
He was one of 4 men carrying an injured officer.
Not one soul ever stepped forward to relieve us. So we carried that man all day long in a condition I could barely carry myself. The next day, the original 4 bearers, including myself, had gone in different directions. Because to continue to do that without getting any relief, all 4 of us would have been dead. And that's not a very pleasant memory.
I made a decision to set goals for myself. I've got to make it to that herd of caribou. When I got to that herd of caribou, I would establish another goal for myself. I never established long-term goals that were impossible to reach. I never established a goal that said, oh, I want to get home. That was not one of my goals. My goals were short range, only to keep me walking and keep me alive, because I knew that if I fell down, I'm dead.
Was that close to the railroad track?
Yeah. But anyway, it's all behind us.
Thank God. Now, see, we can walk away from it now.
Yeah.
Walk away from it, then they'd shoot you.
Yeah.
Well over 5,000 Filipinos and 700 Americans died along the Bataan Road.
You know, I don't go anywhere today without food and water in my trunk.
April 1942. A US task force braves the storms of the Western Pacific. Its destination, a dot in the ocean 400 miles from Japan. Its mission, top secret. Dick Best flew patrols over the fleet. Like everyone else, he hadn't a clue what they were doing there.
20 or 30 miles out into my sector, I saw a ship out there, just a dark shape on the road, still dark. And I veered over to take a closer look at it, but not to get too close. And her deck looked as if they had construction equipment on it, big humpy shapes on the deck. What the devil did she have on? It is the Hornet with Army bombers aboard. I can't believe it, 2-engine bombers, B-25s. General Doolittle is aboard with 16 planes. They're going to bomb Tokyo.
The aim of the Doolittle Raid was to boost Allied morale and take the war to the Japanese. Targets included Tokyo and Yokohama. Chase Nielsen was an air navigator.
About the first thing the pilots did is decided, well, if we're going to go bomb Tokyo, I want to bomb the palace. So the pilots on each of the crews got together and cut the deck of cards to see who got the high card to get to bomb the palace. And when Doolittle found out about it, he went straight in the air. And he said, well, fellas, you can bomb anything in Japan but the palace.
To land safely in China, they had to take off close to Japan. But 700 miles out, the fleet ran into a picket line of Japanese fishing boats. Rod Steiger's destroyer was guarding the Hornet.
Nobody comes near us. Nobody. But on the way, we passed 2 or 3 sampans, you know, with the families on and everything. And we were ordered to destroy them because they're bound to have a radio. And if they radio back...
They started to transmit, and I talked to the Marine colonel aboard, who was an intelligence, Colonel Brown, and he said they'd sent word back to Japan in plain language that they'd sighted 2 enemy carriers off there.
That I will never forget or feel good about till the day I die. I watched, I wasn't shooting, but I watched as the 40 millimeters hit and the women screaming and the children running around. They're shooting at these defenseless people, and inside of your mind you think, what the hell happened to the 10 Commandments? We're not supposed to do this to one another.
The bombers took off there and then, adding 300 miles to their journey.
The ocean was really rough. It wasn't really a good day to fly.
Goodbye, Mama. I'm off to Yokohama for my red, white, and blue. My country and you.
I saw him come up the deck, made a beautiful clean take, climbed right up to altitude. Everybody went off as if they'd been doing it all their life. Till number 6 or 7 in the order got up there, and I thought he saw the green water coming over. He started off, and he pulled up abruptly like this. He climbed about 50 or 150 feet. Suddenly he realized he's pointing straight up in the air, dropped his nose, and then he just staggered. He just cleared the water.
Goodbye, Mama. I'm off to Yokohama for the red, white, and blue. My country and you. Goodbye, Mama. I'm off to Yokohama just to teach all those Japs.
They watched the flagman off to the side, rolled the engines up as high as they'd go. It felt like they were going to shake the whole airplane apart, and finally he gave you the forward motion, and he dropped to the deck, and we started to roll, and there was no problem. The next thing we knew, we were in the air.
What did you feel when you saw Doolittle and the other planes taking off?
Envy. Envy. I would have loved to go on.
A million fighting sons of Uncle Sam, if you please, will soon have all those Japs right down on their Japanese.
So goodbye, Mama. I'm off to Yokohama for my country, my flag and blue.
The planes reached their targets over Japan and dropped their bombs. The damage was small. The buzz was huge.
The pilot and I were singing, "I don't want to set the world on fire." We just want to start a little one in Tokyo.
But almost all the planes ran out of fuel. Chase Nielsen's crashed into the sea. Most of Doolittle's flyers were relayed to safety by pro-Allied Chinese peasants. Chase Nielsen was caught.
The Japanese said, "You're now prisoners of the Japanese 13th Expeditionary Army." And my heart went right down, 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 down. And I said, "According to Geneva Convention, all I can tell you is my name, rank, and serial number." And he said, "What's the Geneva Convention?" He said, "We're fighting a war. Don't you know that?" He said, "We're fighting a war. We're making our rules as we go."
The Japanese condemned to death Chase Nielsen and the 7 others they caught.
Finally, the Emperor sanctioned the execution on 3. I think they took the 2 pilots because the pilot was in charge of the crew, and they took the 1 gunner, Spatz, because he told us, he said, in my interrogation, they asked me if I had used my machine guns, and he said, I told him yes, and if I ever got another chance, I'd do it again. So he signed his own death warrant.
The Americans got off lightly compared with the Chinese. The Japanese devastated villages in reprisal, burning, raping. Nearly 250,000 men, women and children slaughtered. The raid electrified Japanese thinking. The Americans had seized the initiative, threatening Emperor and homeland. Japanese commanders now called for a decisive victory over the US fleet. Admiral Yamamoto, mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, knew time was short before American industrial might kicked in. He was also a gambler. He designed a trap to take Midway, a key US outpost in the dead center of the Pacific. The Americans would race to its defense, and the greatest Japanese armada ever would demolish them. Yamamoto's only problem was that the Americans had cracked the Japanese code and knew the whole plan in advance. And this time, pilot Dick Best got a front row seat.
We were going to hatchet them. The little Japanese were going to come waltzing in the garden gate with a flower in his hand, and we were behind the gate with an axe. We were going to goddamn well cut his head off.
The Japanese came down the garden path and attacked Midway. but the runway remained intact. The Japanese planes hurried back to their carriers to rearm and refuel, while Midway drew breath. Meanwhile, wave after wave of Americans had taken off to attack the Japanese fleet. Most were shot down. Then, low on fuel, dive bomber squadrons, including Dick Best, spotted the enemy carriers below. Their decks a dangerous muddle of planes, bombs and fuel lines. 3 Japanese carriers were doomed.
I pulled up and looked at, saw the first hit. There was a solid column of smoke from bow to stern, at least 200 feet high above it. It must have been an inferno below deck. A carrier under destruction. I can see it in my mind right now. Most impressive sight of the day.
Fujita Iozo, veteran of Pearl Harbor, was attacking a US carrier when his plane was shelled.
My fuel tank was hit and the plane caught fire, so I jumped. I had to parachute from a dangerously low altitude, but I survived. The parachute opened with a bang, and the next moment I smashed into the sea. When I looked around, I saw 3 pillars of smoke in the distance. I later learned that our 3 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, had been destroyed.
For Dick Best, the day just got better and better. He helped sink the 4th Japanese carrier.
The reason I enjoyed Midway so much, not only that we won, but a sweet revenge, and of all things, it was an ambush. An ambush is a dirty term anyway, but we did to the Japanese just what they'd done to us. We ambushed them. It was wonderful. I've never been as exhilarated in my life. It was the best of good days.
The Japanese Navy would never recover from Midway. The fight now became increasingly bitter, a war of attrition. Following victory at Midway, the Allies went on the offensive. On the 7th of August 1942, the US Marines took the first momentous steps onto enemy-held soil. The island was Guadalcanal. The landing was easy. Nothing else was.
You sweat for the signal to move forward, to attack. You just sweat everything out, waiting to attack. It's a time of just waiting and waiting and wonder whether you're going to survive or not survive. How will you respond? Will you be brave in the death, or will you be a coward?
It was the first of many obscure islands suddenly deemed so precious that men must die in droves for them. The battle on Guadalcanal was over this Japanese airstrip, built to enable attacks on Allied bases and on American convoys to Australia. The Japanese saw Guadalcanal as the fork in the road which leads to victory for them, or us. The Marines' first horrifying sight was their own fleet steaming away in fear of a Japanese counterattack.
When we saw the ships leave, go over the horizon, we knew that we were abandoned. And it was a terrible feeling to think we're on that island with no support.
The Marines moved inland, mindful of Bataan. The jungle and malaria were bad enough, but they also faced the Japanese.
They were ferocious fighters. You think they're all dead, and they would lay there in the sand, and when the Marines would walk by, they would jump up and stab them with a rifle or throw a grenade. Of course, they'd end up killing themselves too, but they would take some Marines with them. They were very sneaky.
The Marines on Guadalcanal learned to throw away the rule book.
I didn't intend to take any prisoners because it was a kill or be killed, and they were trying to kill me, and in order for me to survive, I had to kill them.
The Japanese pounded Guadalcanal. Then 2 Marine air squadrons arrived.
The first day they came in, I can remember the excitement. And I can remember old Colonel Rowan, my colonel, with tears streaming down his eyes. He says, "They're ours, they're ours."
I'll never forget the landing when we came in and taxied. They were so glad to see us. As soon as we got on the ground, I met Major Smith, and I said, I suppose you old veterans will show us around. And he said, by tomorrow you will be a veteran.
Introducing Swivel Neck Joe. That's what they call Marine Captain Joe Force, top American ace with 26 Jap planes shot down. His squadron swivels too, constantly looking for enemy planes to add to the 72 they've bagged under the leadership of this South Dakota farm boy.
When I saw Zeros, we went after them. See, you learn a lot faster when you got the hot iron on your tail. When the bridge is burning and you want to get across that baby, you really pick up speed. And these kids, everybody would prove the old point that you're only operating on 10% of your capabilities. Well, these kids started using the whole works, and they were off and running. Light shipping, we went after that. Very few supplies ever got to the island. Everyone that I met had the same thought in mind, and that's we're going to win.
But the Japanese had also landed west of Guadalcanal in New Guinea. Prime targets were the harbours at Milne Bay and Port Moresby. The Japanese were now just 400 miles from Australia. They'd already bombed Darwin. For some of the Allies, the fight was personal.
We knew the speed with which he moved through the islands. We knew his tricks, and we knew that he had Australia in his sights. He was coming to invade Australia. There's no way in the world he was going to get into Australia.
The Japanese Navy's assault on Port Moresby failed, but that didn't stop them. No one thought the Japanese would approach Port Moresby the way they now did, overland across the Owen Stanley Mountains. It was nightmare country. They inched up sheer ravines, through choking undergrowth and cloying swamp, enduring malaria and hunger, muggy days, biting cold nights.
The Australian troops had moved inland from the coast and gathered at Kokoda. Kokoda is on high ground, and that is where the Australians made their stand. We attacked them there, and a battle ensued.
The Australians were beaten back towards Port Moresby, over razorback ridges along the tortuous Kokoda Track.
I was called forward as a Bren gunner to hold the track, and I was there about 15 or 20 minutes on my own, holding this machine gun position. It's not the best of feelings to know that you are the most forward Australian between the Japs and Australia.
With the Japanese at their heels, the Australians retreated, relying on the locals as stretcher bearers.
The care and consideration shown for the wounded by the natives has won the complete admiration of the troops. With them, the black-skinned boys are white.
The Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels were the native boys of New Guinea. They didn't have any time for the Japanese, and they were so gentle that this is the nickname our boys gave them, the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, because they were the only ones that could bring them out. It was terrible terrain. You can imagine the terrible state they were in, those that we did get into hospital. We virtually had to cut their clothes off them. They hadn't been out of them for weeks on end, and they were stiff with mud and dirt, and the smell was shocking. And we were almost frightened to take their boots and socks off because the flesh used to come away with them. I can't talk about that. Sorry. Awful, isn't it, when it comes back to you like that?
It was expected you would do everything possible to help your mate, and he in turn would do the same for you.
With increasing control of the skies, the Allies could drop in food and munitions. But Japanese supply lines were stretched to breaking point.
We needed 600 grams of food per soldier per day. Multiply that by 5,000 men and you're talking about 3 tons of food. It would take a team of several hundred people to transport that amount to the front. The reality was that we didn't have the resources.
Almost in sight of Port Moresby, the Japanese ground to a halt, then retraced their steps back over the Kokoda Track. Meanwhile, the Australians had fought off an assault on Milne Bay, finally debunking the myth of Japanese invincibility.
Those that we hadn't cleaned up in Milne Bay, they were cleaned up on the northern beaches. They didn't have many left when we'd finished with them.
The advancing Allies saw sights which taught them tough lessons.
Oh, it was shocking what he'd do to prisoners of war. They'd capture them and tie them up with wire and bayonet them, moving through the villages. The native women weren't spared, they were raped and mutilated. I mean, it wasn't just a question of sating their lust. I mean, they mutilated them for no reason at all.
We did think of the Japanese basically as animals. It was a war without rules. Possibly that's the best way to describe it, because it was a case of kill or be killed.
We didn't have an opportunity to take many prisoners. We had other things to do with them. We had to kill them initially, and that's what happened. Very few prisoners were taken. But they weren't butchered in cold blood, they were killed in action.
Most of the Japanese captured alive were ill, emaciated, and ravenous.
It was the first area that we'd seen cannibalism. They must have been that hungry. They cut flesh off the legs and the buttocks of our men. They had the meat in dixies and they were cooking it in pots when we moved through and saw the areas. Horrible, horrible sight.
As far as cannibalism goes, I heard men using phrases like black pig and white pig. Black pig referred to eating a native, and white pig meant eating a white man. I also heard they ate the flesh from dead Japanese soldiers as well.
A Japanese prisoner warned, "Make no matter about us dead. More will come. We never stop coming. Soon you all be Japanese." October 1942. Even after Midway, the Japanese had the firepower to maul the Enterprise and sink the Hornet, the carrier that had launched the Doolittle Raid. Despite the reverses on Guadalcanal and New Guinea, Japanese power in the Pacific was only dented. 250 million people now lived under the rising sun. The Japanese proclaimed themselves the liberators of Asia from white colonial rule. Asia was, they said, for the Asians.
No, it's a joke. They came in as conquerors and as superior beings. There was no doubt that they were the masters.
Wherever the Japanese went, they laid down the law. Woe betide anyone suspected of withholding information.
They tortured my father. They slowly peeled off his skin. It was almost as if they were peeling the skin off a frog. They used their bayonets, and my father kept screaming for help. He asked us children for our help, and he asked the Japanese to forgive him, even though he'd done nothing wrong. He said to them, "Please stop, I'm in agony. My children, my wife, please help me." That's what my father kept screaming.
Yun ang isinisigaw lagi ng tatay ko.
Japan had ousted the old colonial powers and held 140,000 of their soldiers captive.
They told us that we were the rabble of a lost army. While we had no status as human beings, the gracious Japanese would treat us fairly and kindly.
Those captured on the islands were shifted where needed, tight-packed in the sweltering holds of the hell ships.
The men were going mad in the bowels of the ship, some to the point that they slashed the wrist of a sleeping American and drank the blood from his wrist to put some liquid into their bodies.
60,000 POWs, half of them British, were jammed into goods wagons and transported to Thailand, clinging to humanity in humiliating conditions.
Nearly everybody had gut trouble, dysentery, diarrhea of some sort, and you can imagine the problem of the people so crowded. You had to get to the opening of the door, the sliding doors, and your pals who were sitting near the door would hold on to you while you sat there with your ass out the wagon, and you done it best way you could, outside.
The prisoners' task, to build the death railway into Burma. They gouged out cuttings. They spanned ravines, all by hand. An army so negligent of the welfare of its own men was not about to treat enemy POWs with care. 21-year-old Hiroshi Abe was the engineer responsible for the 30-kilometre section at the Thai-Burma border.
When all those prisoners came up into the mountains, what was there ready for them? Nothing. Nothing at all. At Songkrai, I received about 1,000 prisoners. There were just 5 or 10 huts, barely covered with bamboo. No food stores, nothing. We had to put them to work deep in the mountains on the Thai-Burma Railway without any preparations. It was impossible, absolutely impossible. But that's what top brass at Japanese General Headquarters ordered us to do.
Using press-ganged Asian labour as well, the Japanese set out to build 250 miles of line in just 16 months.
The Japanese just used to say, Speedo, Speedo, Speedo. It was one word they knew and understood, and one word we knew and understood. And then they said Speedo, it really meant Speedo. And they had a task to finish. And they told us, it didn't matter. If you all die, we'll build the railway.
You had to have muckers to survive. 3 was an ideal number. If one was sick, the other 2 could tend to him, take care of him, can lay anything like that. You had to have muckers.
Tony, rest his soul, it could have been 3/4 to a mile. The last, he carried me on his back into that camp. Anyway.
I remember sitting in a little running creek at the 75 kilo in June, trying to cleanse myself. I just fouled my pants and tried to clean myself up the best I could, being helped back to my bunk, which was 2 tiers up by a friend who, with his arm around me to help me get back to my quarters.
The Australian nurses captured on Bangka Island wondered if survival was worth the suffering.
Well, we actually did envy the girls who had been lost at sea. Well, you see, it was dreadful. You were nursing someone, one of your own friends, and you knew they couldn't survive. I might say, even the girls who were massacred, we thought were luckier than we, because it was all over so quickly.
Next week on Hell in the Pacific, the propaganda war of hate, death and survival in Japanese and Allied prison camps, and the experiences of the women in hell.